Hello, good afternoon, Beverly Hills Bar Association. Welcome to Podcast Power Plays, Legal Strategies for Representing Talent in Audio. I'm Jonathan Kornman. I'm Broadcast Labor Counsel for SAG-AFTRA out of the San Francisco, Northern California office, and I will be moderating this afternoon's panel. I'm also getting over a bit of a cold, so please apologies in advance if you hear me clear my voice. But thankfully, I won't be doing most of the talking as I'm joined today by two incredible speakers, Rebecca Steinberg and Eric Spiegelman. Rebecca is a United Talent Agency agent in the audio department. She comes to UTA from ACAS, where she served as Director of Development, overseeing the content acquisition team and working with creators to launch their shows, grow their audiences, and optimize audio business. Prior to ACAST, Rebecca worked at Tastemade and in the digital talent department and at CAA in entertainment marketing. Eric Spiegelman is an attorney that specializes in podcasts. Eric's clients include podcast studios, producers, and talent. He has been on the ground floor of the creation of many important names in the podcast industry, and with that has a wealth of knowledge that he will be sharing with us today. Eric graduated from UC Hastings College of the Law and from Boston University. At the end, we will be taking questions, which I kindly ask you to put in the chat for me to read out. And now, with that, let's get started. So first of all, could you both tell me how you got into this industry that we call podcasting?
Sure, I'll start. So like many, I found my way into the audio industry just by way of passion. I was an avid listener. I had been working in talent management at a production company, like you mentioned, called Tastemade for a few years, and started listening to a lot of podcasts. Dirty John, Esther Perel, Small Town Dicks. I ended up landing a job at Acast where I did content acquisition and development for them. And that is where I met my now colleagues at UTA. So I was on the other side of the table from them negotiating deals, which was tough. And then I eventually got pulled over to the representation side. So I've been in the audio space for 6+ years now. It's been an interesting time. And I'll let Eric fill us in as well.
Sure. I started life as a production attorney for indie films, and over right around the time that a lot of digital publishing and digital media was getting off the ground, and I found myself far more fascinated by digital than I did film. Eventually got a job, a great transition job at HBO running legal for a couple websites that they had launched way back when, and left there to go work for a digital production company in digital video, then went off on my own as a lawyer. And one of my first clients, like the week that I hung my own shingle, was a small startup called Earwolf, which started as a small comedy podcast network and grew and grew and grew until it became Stitcher, and then was acquired by First Scripts and then SiriusXM a couple years ago. And once I was in podcasting, I never left, and I've been doing this for 12 years, if you can believe that.
So both kind of started out as fans and now you're in it. So I can relate to that. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. From your vantage points, I mean, I've done two panels on this topic with Beverly Hills Bar Association over the past 3 years, and even the last year, the industry has gone through some pretty big changes. So from your viewpoints, what are the biggest changes you've seen in the podcast industry?
Um, there's been a lot. I think the last 5 years has been not fraught, but very interesting. Things have just shifted considerably over and over and over again. I'd say a couple years ago, the market was really, really soft, but things are definitely starting to open up again. We're seeing buyers who had paused their financial guarantees starting to rethink that strategy. There's a little bit more money coming into the industry again. And what that means on my end and on Eric's end is that there's just more competition, which makes it much more fun. And also, advertisers are becoming much more savvy in their approach, with YouTube becoming one of the biggest platforms for podcast consumption. Um, there's also a lot that has changed in terms of how buyers approach ownership. It used to kind of be the Wild West, right? People were making deals without understanding the implications of any of the terms that they were negotiating on. But now we're seeing that buyers, really want to take a stake in what they're backing, whether that's co-owning the IP or even taking full control of the RSS feed or some sort of sunset revenue share post-term. There's just a little bit less wiggle room than there used to be. So we have to be nimble and flexible in the way we're making deals. And then, yeah, you compare that to 2020, no one knew what they were really doing back then. We were just making it up as we were going, and deals were looser. Now they're much more tighter and calculated. So I'll let Eric jump in as well.
Around every 9 months, there's a tectonic shift in podcasting. It's been like that for a while. And the latest shift is this movement towards YouTube, frankly. I would say video. I mean, Spotify video is part of the shift as well. Um, it's really this idea that podcasts are not just audio anymore. A podcast is both video and audio at the same time. It's the same show, just different, whether or not you can see it or not. And the number of people watching podcasts on YouTube is absolutely enormous right now. And I think it's driving some measure of YouTube's recent growth. And it's really kind of influencing every deal that I come across as well. And podcasting, it's not just video. Podcasting is just one slice of this bigger overall picture that can include live events, live podcasts. It can include social. It can include newsletters. It can include subscription. We're starting to see digital media really round out in an interesting way. And sometimes I tell people that podcasting was the last piece of the puzzle. Like this is what's podcasting is the version of digital media that makes all of it kind of make sense in some really profound ways. So that's where I think we are right now.
And on the deal making side, what that means is buyers are asking for more rights, right? So
Yeah.
with YouTube being, such a big platform for consumption and social being a platform for marketing, a lot of the buyers we work with are looking to monetize across everything. So as reps and as lawyers, we have to be really mindful about just getting very specific in the deals as to what the distributor buyer has access to.
Mhm. Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
And kind of on that note, we could jump into the first topic since we're talking about deals, which is monetization, which historically audio has really relied on ads as supporting as the main driver of revenue. But, as you've even just touched on just now, there's all these different assets that now you can bring to the table. There's also the subscription model. What are the pros and cons of each of these avenues, and how do you advise clients when representing them in terms of monetization?
You want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, the bulk of podcasting is ad supported. And the sort of main deal point on the monetization thing is what we call the rev share, which is basically, what percentage of revenue goes to the client. That's really the most intensely negotiated part, I think, of any deal. That and whether or not the client is getting an advance in that revenue. We borrowed a term from movie distribution, the minimum guarantee, the MG. That is both the advance and kind of like the ante when a studio makes a bet on a talent. That's what they're saying. We think we're going to make this amount of money off your show. And so that's what we're bidding on. What I think agents like Rebecca and her colleagues often do is try and get that MG up to the highest it can be, as well as the percentage of rev share. And if you'll have a client who is lucky enough to be bid on by multiple studios, that is what everybody's kind of trying to gin up there. There are some other things around that, but in terms of podcasting revenue, those are the two big items.
And then also, Jonathan, I think you mentioned subscription as part of revenue strategy. So
Mhm.
it really depends on the client, but we're typically telling clients to diversify their revenue streams, right? So subscription has become an extremely important part of our business day to day. And if your client has a real hold on their audience and a real connection with them, they can develop that community into something that becomes the backbone of their business. There's like real money to be seen there. So we often advise clients to, build their audience as big as they possibly can and distribute their podcast publicly on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple, wherever you can get your podcast, and then start considering a strategy that's paywalled, so that they can convert their most loyal followers to paid subscribers. That strategy doesn't work for everyone. And it also is kind of genre dependent. And then sometimes clients, they have such a niche audience that advertising doesn't necessarily make sense for them. So sometimes you'll see a podcast that was once distributed publicly, go completely behind a paywall. So let's say there's a show, they get 25,000 downloads an episode. That's on the smaller side. And what that means from an advertising perspective is they're getting like $400 per spot. If you're thinking, they're selling at a $25 CPM or $30 CPM. On the subscription side, that 25,000 followers can actually be like 100 grand in revenue on the aggressive side. So there are different ways to play it, and there's really no one size fits all, but generally speaking, we're looking at, many different ways of distribution for our clients.
Right. And I imagine related to that with the, surge in YouTube now becoming the main way that people consume podcasts, as they're still called, although we can touch on if that's even what they should be called anymore. How has that affected monetization? Because, I know with podcasts and audio only format, there's dynamic advertising and you have traditional ad spots, but YouTube and the advent of video and even the using social media more has like really opened up a lot more avenues for advertising, I imagine. So could you touch on how that's changed deal making and representing talents from a monetization standpoint?
Well, YouTube, we're in a bit of a transition phase right now with how let's just call them podcasts for the sake of having a word, because you're right, we don't have a good word for this anymore. But if you're putting a podcast on YouTube, um, we're only at the beginning of podcast networks selling that YouTube inventory in the same way they sell it for a podcast. The technology is still amping up. There are actually a couple different ways that you can generate ad revenue on YouTube, and these become deal points. One is the direct sale method, which is what podcast advertising is mostly built on. It's here's a script. We want your host to read it. We want you to say, go out and buy a Casper mattress. Um, you can do that in video, not quite yet through what they call dynamic serving of the ads, dynamic insertion. That's when you put an ad in and you swap it out later. With YouTube, it's harder to take out at the moment, but I imagine that's going to change. But then you have this other YouTube specific piece of inventory called, which is basically Google AdSense. And that is a programmatic automated ad selling platform that YouTube operates. And those are two completely different revenue streams. And it's important to be cognizant of both when you're making a deal.
I'll also add that what we're seeing right now is a shift in the way that brands and agencies are thinking about advertising on podcasts. They're becoming much more savvy. And of course, there's, the market is chock full of DR brands like Casper and HelloFresh who are always going to be looking to buy spots and dots on podcasts. But there are also many brands coming into the space who are looking to buy 360. So before you had podcast buyers buying on the podcast and social buyers who were buying on social, and they weren't talking to each other even though they worked at the same agency. Now there seems to be a little bit more connective tissue between these two different areas of business. And so you have brands and agencies who are coming to us, the agency, or to the buyer distributor, be it a SiriusXM or an iHeart, saying, we want to buy podcast, we want to buy video, we want to buy TikTok and Instagram, and we want a whole package, because for us, that is a deeper, more strategic way to engage with talent and ultimately to reach their audience. So what that means is the deals are just looking different. It's much more interesting. There seems to be a little bit more money, although that could change with, the economy. But yeah, there's just more investment being made in the space right now.
Rebecca just used one of my favorite pieces of jargon or trade speak for
Oh, what did I
podcasting.
say?
Spots and dots.
Oh, spots and dots.
Spots and dots. That just means basically like standard advertising inventory, like pre-roll spots and mid-roll spots. Um, I love that phrase though. Spots and dots.
Right. And then just for those who aren't, listening in that aren't aware, dynamic ads are in a podcast. If you have whoever is distributing it, you can place these little markers in the audio and you'll usually hear a cue that's like, you're about to hear an ad and now we're out of the ad. And those markers get switched out depending on what month it is, where you are located, and it's tied to the GPS of your phone. So that's what's considered dynamic ads versus baked in ads, which are literally baked into the audio and can't be changed. And then what we were talking about is how YouTube is kind of different because they don't really have that same dynamic ad system where as YouTube is selling a block of shows and that specific ad is changing all the time, like you would with when you listen to a podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Did I explain that correctly to
That's
X?
good. We should have written up a glossary for BHBA. Didn't think of that.
Well, on the topic of advertising, another wrinkle is branded podcasts, which I think have, I guess, in the 9 month time span that you talked about, Eric, earlier, have had their peaks and valleys probably. Do you all want to touch on that at all? Like, what have you been making deals directly with brands for, sponsored content essentially, or has that kind of gone away a little bit? Tell me each what your perspectives are on branded podcasts.
I've done a couple recently. I mean, what I've seen more of in the branded podcast, it's usually like an advertiser coming and saying, "Well, I want to make this podcast," and then it lives forever as this little production that they made, right? Like, and there have been some very good ones. The Tinder branded podcast a few years ago was one of the best. They did a couple seasons of that. But what I find more interesting and what I'm seeing brands do from time to time is can come in as a launch sponsor and they can be that first sponsor, the title sponsor, and they can determine they can basically bankroll an entire season of a show, but also not not be the sole brand that's affiliated with it. They'll either take a step back when it's over and the podcast runs for as a normal podcast after that, or they will only take um, what's called category exclusivity, where if, like, let's say Hyundai was wanted to do a launch sponsorship of your podcast, they would make it so that they would ask you not to include any other car ads for as long as they're doing that presenting sponsorship. That is frankly one of my favorite ways that podcasts get financed right now, and I want to see more of that.
And on my end, what I'm seeing is brands being interested in like branded content, like branded segments that live in the show that integrates their product, or fully branded episodes where the talent is engaging with the product in a unique way. But it has to feel authentic to the show, of course. I'm seeing quite a bit more of that. I think that the challenge is most brands are looking for data to back up their decision making. So when it's an entirely new show, and we have no idea how many downloads it's going to do, what the performance is going to look like, it's challenging, right? Unless there is, a really great talent attached, who we know can convert their audience. But, I know back in, I don't know, 2020, there were quite a few branded podcasts that were limited series, and I don't know if they saw the return that they were hoping for. So I do think there's been a bit of a shift in how brands are looking to align in kind of the branded content space.
Absolutely. Next, a topic that I know Eric is really excited to talk about that we wanted to touch on was RSS feeds, which are really a fundamental part of the tech of podcasts that, many people don't really fully understand what it is. So please, we could start with you, Eric. Could you tell us
Sure.
why this is such a fundamental part of podcasts when representing talent?
So RSS feeds, you can look at RSS feeds as a kind of IP right, but I don't know if IP really is the right description for it. I don't know if it's really intellectual property. It's a bundle of different things. But the taking a step back from like a 30,000 foot level, the RSS feed is the way that a podcast reaches its audience. It's the distribution path. It's the closest analogy I can think of is it's a broadcast tower. But instead of it being, a multi-million dollar piece of construction, it's something that anyone can create like pretty quickly, and it can be moved in a way that a broadcast tower cannot be moved. It can go from your RSS feed can go from ad network to ad network, and your audience won't even know that it's there. But won't even know there's been a change. But what an RSS feed is it's effectively your account on a content management system where you upload your media files, and it's your account, the show's account on a podcast distribution platform. In fact, more often than not, multiple different podcast distribution platforms. And the content management system spits out an automated line of code. It looks like a website if you were to go to the type in the URL for the RSS feed itself. It just looks like you can look at it in your browser. It's a website with a bunch of random variables on it. But the content management system, every time you upload your media file, it automatically updates this website. You plug that in, you basically copy and paste that URL into your distribution platform, and the distribution platform literally just checks that website every couple minutes, every day. That's all it does. And then when it notices a change, it tells your audience, hey, there's a new episode that's been live. And what happens is when the audience clicks on that episode, it's not coming through Apple Podcasts or Simplecast or anything like that. Apple Podcasts is just acting as a traffic cop, and it's telling your device to go to this content management system to download this file or to stream this file. Um, it is the most important, that collection of things, those user accounts and what goes on between them. The reason that is the most important piece of IP is that is your show's connection to its audience. It is a very hard connection. When somebody clicks subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Simplecast or ever all the places that it goes, that means they are going to hear, or they are going to be presented with the option of hearing almost every episode that comes through. In fact, if they're an avid listener, it's going to automatically populate their device. That process determines the value of the podcast from an ad network's perspective. The number of people who are subscribers, the number of people who click play through that entire process, that is all facilitated by the RSS feed. And independent podcasts, people who just set this up on their own and they became, let's say they grew a huge audience and they became very famous, they own and control that RSS feed. And that allows them a deal structure that's different if they don't own it. For example, most of the podcast deals that are being cut every single day are deals where a Stitcher or an iHeart or a Wondery are effectively taking a short-term representation of this RSS feed. They're saying this feed is going to be under our control for a term of between 1 and 3 years. And during that time, we're going to be serving ads to all the people who subscribe to that feed. And at the end of that term, if that podcast studio or podcast ad network doesn't give the owner of that feed terms that they like, that owner can take their feed and move it to a different one. It happens all the time. People leave Wondery and go to SiriusXM. People leave SiriusXM and go to iHeart. People leave iHeart and go to Acast. And all that's happening is the team that is physically selling the ads and paying the artist is changing, but the means by which the show gets distributed to the audience does not change at all. It may shift content management systems. It may move from like Megaphone, which is the name of a content management system that's owned by Spotify. It may move from that platform to Art19, and there's some like stuff you got to do when you make that switch. But for the most part, the whole RSS feed is still remains controlled by the talent. That ownership of the feed in the early days of podcasting, it was very common that nobody understood what that meant, and now people are more savvy. If you were accepting financing for a new show, the ownership of that feed is going to be a negotiation. A lot of studios, if they put any upfront money for a brand new show that doesn't have an audience, they're going to expect to own it. There's a lot of nuance to that. There's a lot of ways to kind of slice up those rights and figure out how long you have them and how you buy them back and how you get them back, and what that means and what that looks like. And there's a lot of different deals you can cut around that. But that is probably one of the recent developments of the last few years is a lot of innovation of who owns it and how they get transferred if it's a brand new show.
That was excellent, by the way.
Thank you.
RSS feeds are very technical, but I just want to add a couple things to that. You know, with buyers becoming a little bit more savvy about the deals that they're making, and many of them are looking to own or co-own the feed. Oftentimes what we're telling our clients to do if we're not getting a deal that is favorable to them is to launch their show independently, build an audience up, have downloads and an audience that they can point to, and then we go turn around and do a deal with one of the buyers, and we're in a much better position to own the RSS feed and own the IP. So that's a strategy that we're using every day. And then just to kind of double down on Eric's point, if the Kelsey brothers, for instance, didn't own their podcast feed, they wouldn't be in a position to go to Wondery and Amazon and secure their reportedly $100 million deal, right? So if they co-owned it with someone and they were looking to go do that deal, they'd likely have to go share half that revenue with a third party. So it's really important, and sometimes we don't realize, well, now we realize, what it means to own that feed, because long term it just has serious effects on your business and your ability to build a business that lives beyond the first year of the podcast.
I would say that the vast majority of top podcasters who you hear about cutting the multi-million-dollar deals, started those shows on their own, and as a result, they own their feed, and it's the feed, as Rebecca said, that allows them to command that money.
Right. And we actually have one question that just came in related to this specific topic. So before we continue, do you think we should hear what the
Go
question
for
is?
it.
What types of deals have you seen around artists acquiring profit ownership interests in the RSS feed post-term?
That's a good question. It's not at all standardized right now. One thing, the first thing is that when you say co-ownership of a feed, it's sort of a very loose concept because, truth be told, only one like it's really binary, the operation of an RSS feed. Someone has to make a decision what to upload. Someone has to make a decision if they're going to change platforms. There's not a lot of there's not a lot of room for co-ownership in the way that word applies to things like a copyright or anything else. So if a financier finances a podcast and they own the feed and they want to give the feed back to the talent, then they will sometimes take a post-term revenue share that is either a permanent revenue share of some percentage of net, or it's a, I don't know what the term for this is. In my head, I call it reverse vesting. They keep their they keep a big percentage in year one, and then year two it falls a little bit, and then year three it falls a little bit. And that can extend for a number of years, or it can only be 1 year or 3 years, and then disappears. The idea being that the financing that goes into the show doesn't just finance the production, it's a capital investment in that feed itself. It's an investment in that connection to the audience. So if I spend $100,000 on your podcast and you grow to 1 million listeners, my $100,000 has brought you that 1 million listeners. And after the term of our deal is up, you're still going to have that 1 million listeners, and that's going to print money for you for the next however many years. So there's an argument that I need to get a return on my capital, and that capital, that broadcast tower, that RSS feed, that's the thing that's going to be keep bringing in the money. On the other hand, it's entirely possible and even likely that after you leave that deal, the audience is going to grow further. The original investment doesn't have any claim on that additional audience that grows after it. So at some point, it doesn't make any sense for that original financier to keep having the same level of participation in the show. These are all very this is all very fluid right now. Like, I've seen many different ways of doing this. I came up with what I thought was a very smart formula how to figure out a post-term participation on a podcast, and I presented it to a major studio and they dismissed it out of hand, which was a bummer, but I'm going to keep revisiting it and try and make it standard.
On the topic of RSS feeds, again, bringing it back to YouTube, how has video changed things with regards to RSS feeds when representing talent?
So with video, it's ownership of the YouTube channel that is sort of the most equivalent part of the RSS feed. Um, that there's also YouTube, there's a weird thing where you can own a channel, but you can plug it into the network's content management system so they can manage your channel for you so that you actually keep ownership while they do all the important pulling of the levers and uploading of the files and managing all the analytics for you. Um, it's a similar conversation. It doesn't necessarily fall in lockstep with the ownership of the RSS feed itself, but it usually does, I think. Um, but YouTube as a platform is like a more compressed version of that RSS feed that I talked about. YouTube is both the content management system and the distribution platform in one. So that whole operation, it's all kind of self-contained. So the YouTube channel is the video equivalent of the RSS feed. With Spotify video, I think, is it the same or it's a little bit different because I think you have to serve the video into Spotify, and then they pull the audio out of the video to populate their version of the audio feed. It's starting to get a little bit complicated, all this, frankly, because what used to be very simple was this: you upload here and it shows up everywhere. Now you have to upload it to multiple places, and each platform that's now dominant in video has a little bit of a different way of managing that, the feed equivalent.
And what that means from a data perspective is that it's all very kind of bifurcated, and you have to aggregate data manually in order to get a full picture of what someone's audience looks like, right? So you pull data from your hosting platform, and then you pull data from Spotify video, and you pull from YouTube and grab those views, and then you can start to piece together how many people the podcast is actually reaching, and then use that number to go to advertisers and say, you know, based on this calculation, this is the price per spot.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of tricky. But honestly, data has always been an issue in the audio space. Um, it's 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 not equal among platforms and among hosting platforms. So there's still a lot of improvement to be made there.
And creates a lot more fun work for those representing talent, I imagine.
Indeed.
Um, so we already touched on some of them, ownership being the main one, but just like again, zooming out on to close the loop on the topic of RSS feeds, what do you think are the most important deal points when representing a podcaster in negotiations with a studio? What are the main things that RSS feeds and also YouTube are going to kind of play into that negotiation?
So this is not something that's ever been a problem, but I think it's important for everyone to keep their eye on, because if it ever is a problem, we're not really prepared for it at the moment. But when you own your feed and you make a deal with an ad sales network, that deal is going to term out at some point, and you may move to a different network. If that happens, the ad network has to, quote unquote, give you your feedback. And there's a process there, especially if you change content management systems. Um, we've been operating on a very handshake trust system for this process for the entire time that podcasting has been around. Everybody just sort of understands that when you when you get your feedback, that your previous ad sales network will be very helpful in handing it off to the next one. In the event of a dispute, if it ever became unclear about who was supposed to take control of that feed at the end of the term, we don't have a good mechanism for dealing with that right now. So what's important when I do in all my deals is I make sure it very clearly spells out that the ad network that I would be leaving will cooperate and do X, Y, and Z when it comes to handing me my feed rights back. So that's very clear that I create an actual contractual right of action that if they don't follow those steps, I have a clear remedy for it.
The other main pieces, and I mean, I think Eric and I, we don't disagree, but we have kind of different perspectives on the master files. So that's always something that's negotiated. Who owns that? Who owns those? And the IP, of course, right? The underlying IP is absolutely key, because you can own your RSS feed, but if somebody else owns the IP, not that we would ever make a deal like that, you're kind of screwed when it comes to building, derivative works or ancillaries off the back of your project. And as an agent, I mean, that's one of the most important things. We're looking at a podcast as like a springboard for other business and business expansion into so many different revenue streams. So, that is one of the main lookouts.
Right.
I feel like I have to explain to everyone what our disagreement is about the masters.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't go for it.
So there's been a recent I don't know if it's a trend, but there have been a few deals in only the last few months where streamers have bought entire libraries of podcast episodes. HBO did it with, I think, a Sopranos rewatch. And Netflix has done it I think at least once or twice I've seen in the news where they took an entire show off of YouTube and put it on a platform where it was a podcast. This
Wasn't
is a
it
thing
Pop
that
the
seems to
Balloon?
be, what's that?
Wasn't it Pop the Balloon?
It might have been Pop the Balloon. It was that game show, the dating game show, right? This may or may not become a trend, but before, the last few months, we didn't really see a lot of deals like that, and that led me to believe that the master recordings of a podcast actually were not really worth anything because the generation of value in a podcast comes entirely from the amount of people who subscribe because they're the ones listening to every new piece of content you put in, and that is where the bulk of the ads are. There is some residual value to what we call back catalog episodes, like old library episodes of a podcast, but it's minuscule compared to the most recent 3 or 4 episodes that are being pushed through there. So there were situations a while back where I would, when I was working with Stitcher, where we made the decision that we would be comfortable not necessarily owning those masters so long as we had very clear rights to the feed because that's how we were generating all our revenue. Rebecca's might be right. It's shifting a little bit.
Yeah.
We'll
Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say my POV is kind of based on my mother's listening habits, which inform my deal making. She's like a crazy true crime listener. She listens to a lot of like NBC Dateline stuff, and she binges the catalog. There's a lot of binge listening in the audio space, and every single time she listens to one of those shows, she gets served a fresh programmatic ad, meaning that that back catalog is being monetized over and over and over again. So that can actually be really, really meaningful revenue for shows that are evergreen like that. So I absolutely see Eric's point. I just think there are a few cases where that back catalog is just super valuable.
Right, depending on the genre.
Yeah.
Um, on the topic of ancillary works and derivative works, I feel like a few years ago there was a bit of a gold rush. Everyone thought their podcast was going to be the next Dolores Roach and didn't
Mhm.
really pan out that way. But of course, those deals are still being made, and it's still an important thing to keep in mind for both representatives and podcast creators, some of them when starting a podcast. What are key parts of those deals now from the perspective of derivative works and ancillary works?
I mean, I'll let Eric speak to the deal piece, but we're always looking at uh, live touring opportunities off the back of a podcast. We're looking at merchandise as a natural extension. There's apparel, there's collectibles, there's like show themed products, mugs, hats, whatever it is. There's subscription, which we talked about earlier. Books. Many of our podcast clients end up becoming authors, be it a memoir or a novel or a spin-off of their narrative series. And then, of course, there's the TV film adaptation side of things as well.
Yeah. I mean, the only ancillaries I would add to that are newsletters, which serve not only as a brand extension, but another venue for selling sponsorship. And product launches are something you're seeing more and more with popular podcasters. There's podcasters out there with their own beauty brands and their own wellness brands, and there's got to be at least one with their own liquor brand. I can't think of one, but they seem to be popular. Um, and with all of these, each one of these slices of rights, they are all negotiated. Nobody just leaves them hanging, especially the derivative rights, even though there are fewer. During that derivative gold rush you were talking about, I think most of the shows that were getting adapted were limited series documentaries. I think Dolores Roach was one of the few scripted series that got adapted or at least picked up for adaptation. There have been a couple, but a lot of the action was in limited series documentaries, often true crime. That there are fewer limited series being made right now, which is probably why there's fewer of them getting optioned. But there are still lots of untapped derivative potential for all kinds of podcasts. And I think a lot of what if I were to make a prediction, because that always works out well, I think you're going to see a lot of innovation in format over the next couple of years, especially as you move to YouTube, and then adapting those podcast formats to television um, could be big business at some point.
Right. And do you think YouTube has kind of impacted that pipeline from, to adaptation significantly or not really?
I don't know if it has yet. We haven't seen a podcast that started as a podcast, then moved to YouTube, then explode to a point where it gets adapted off the popularity on YouTube. But there's certainly the potential for that. I mean, one of the reasons that podcasts love YouTube is that podcasts are generally incredibly hard to market, and the YouTube algorithm is like a godsend to podcast marketing. So you're seeing there are a lot of podcasts out there that are doing 3 to 5 times the audience on YouTube as they are doing on audio, and that's just because YouTube makes it so much easier to find your audience.
Right. Well, before we get into questions, and we have about 14 minutes left, any final takeaways, thoughts to those either that are podcasters themselves or our fellow representatives of podcast creators?
We need a new word. Like
New, new word.
podcasting was fine when it was just audio, but now that it's video and social and all these other things, like, and it's all the same product that's slightly different based on how you watch it or how you listen to it or how you interact with it. We don't have a word that means all those things. So if somebody comes up with a good word, please email me.
What about vodcast? I keep hearing that. You don't like it. You hate it. Okay.
We also talked about generated content, but decided that wouldn't work either because it's not just one user. There's still like a production team often behind these shows. So,
I wanted to reclaim the word broadcast and apply it to this, and somebody told me that was a terrible idea.
well, we do have a few questions, so I'll start reading them out. We already answered one of them. Thank you again, Sharonda. That was a great question earlier. So Scott asks, is the international market significant? How does it differ? And how do you aggregate all the data from those markets or these markets?
I can start. I mean, so UTA has an arm in the UK, and I think the international market is absolutely significant. Not all of these markets are as advanced from an advertising perspective, though. There's just not as much spend happening, although that's, of course, going to change in the next 9 months, as Eric said. But in terms of aggregating data from all these markets, the hosting platform, so that's the platform where you upload your podcast episodes and then it gets distributed to all the various streaming platforms. That's where all of the data is aggregated. And it's typically or almost always broken out by market. So you can see how many listeners the podcast has in the US versus in the UK versus in Australia, Canada, and so on and so forth. And so, there are certain companies, Acast is a good example, that have sales teams in 7 markets, in Sweden, in the UK, in Mexico, in Australia, and they're able to sell all of those different market listens to the brands that are unique to their market and ultimately drive more revenue for that show. Anything you would add, Eric?
No, I think you answered it better than I could have.
I used to work at Acast as mentioned, so yeah, shout out.
And they're actually not even based in the US, is that, or their main office isn't there,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah. Main office, Sweden. They have an office in New York, though.
Right. Okay, Shannon asks, do you see anything in deals regarding platforms that have the ability to skip ads, i.e. fast forward 10 to 15 seconds? And how does that affect ad revenue and deal making?
I mean, I think Rebecca, you might see more of that when you're making the deals, but it from where I've seen it, skipping ads doesn't really affect. Like I think that's kind of baked into the overall metric of how audiences like interact with these shows. I mean, if you ever look at like I forget the name of the chart, but there are these charts that audience retention charts. So like over the course of an episode, how many people are still listening after X number of minutes? It generally like slopes down over time gently, but when you have an ad, it always goes like this because a lot of people are skipping it. That I don't know of anyone who's ever asked like what the percentage of skips from an audience are. I think it varies. A lot of that's probably because it varies person to person. Like anecdotally, I'll skip some ads and I'll forget to skip others. Um, or they're actually because I work in this field, I often I'm listening more to the ads than I am to the actual show. But it doesn't really register as far as I've seen in any material deal term in a contract.
Same, same. But if, there are ways to track conversion in the audio space. And if an advertiser is not seeing the conversion that they were hoping to see, then they're not going to buy on the show again.
Yeah.
So, uh, what that means is when a talent is reading an ad for a brand, they need to do it in a way that actually feels organic and real. If it's phoned in, they're not going to have a repeat customer.
Yeah.
Right, which I think has for a long time been one of the biggest selling points in advertising for podcasts is that there's this parasocial relationship between the host and the audience. And it's not like when you're watching TV, there's like an immediate vibe shift and you know you're watching an ad. Sometimes it's hard and that line is more blurred.
Yeah.
And
The iHeart Awards actually have a category for best ad read, which if you're purely an audience member seems kind of silly, like why would we care? But to advertisers, that means quite a bit. If somebody's winning an award for the quality of their reads, that's going to increase their CPM.
make them a sought after client, I'm sure, by either of you. So great question. Thank you, Shannon. Another question we have from Sky. Would you recommend beginning as a content creator on YouTube or I guess on a podcast audio only platform or maybe both?
I would say both. There's no reason you can't do simultaneously anymore. And sort of the dirty little secret is that having that podcast aspect to your show is going to unlock more revenue on YouTube than it would if you were only a YouTube channel, you may not get the same ad rates.
Mhm.
I would agree.
And Patricia asks, I find it interesting that video watching has a greater audience than audio only listening, given that it is much easier to listen than watch while driving, exercising, etc. Does this ratio vary by genre and age of listener?
I mean, I think it really varies by age. A lot of Gen Z and millennials are consuming video. And they're using TikTok and social platforms every day, and that lends itself to watching content. That said, a lot of consumption on YouTube is actually in the background these days. So someone might start watching the episode and then they end up switching to just listening to it, but it's playing in the background of their
Yeah.
screen.
A, a lot of one of the weird things about how YouTube, how why some shows do so well on YouTube is that YouTube is much more responsive to who the guest is on a podcast than any audio platform is. So if you have an interview, a chat show, and you interviewed um, every member of the U.S. House, let's just say, your listens on your podcast would probably be very consistent episode to episode. But if you did that on YouTube and you had, say, AOC as a guest, YouTube would pick that up and flag all the other AOC fans on the YouTube platform and serve that episode to them. So all the other episodes on YouTube would be going flat, and then you might see a giant spike of people who are suddenly interested in AOC, um, suddenly tune into your show, and you may keep some of those people, you may not, but the audiences just find your shows in a much different way. So I would say, like, in addition to it being age dependent and sometimes genre specific, it has to do with the personalities and whether or not they're triggering something in the YouTube algorithm.
Right. Okay, thank you for that question. Another one, this one from Angela asks, how are the ads chosen, e.g., discretion of the podcaster or via agent? How do you prevent unsuitable ads, e.g., responsible advertising policy as a contractual term?
Sure. So
Yeah.
most there's most of the advertising selling is handled by these ad networks, Sirius, iHeart, Wondery, etc. So when you have a podcast, the first thing you do when you make a deal is you set your kind of baseline. I will not do ad reads in these categories. We call that the block list. And so they're pretty standard. It's like a lot of it's like pornography, religious materials, guns. Some people do alcohol. Some people are very not into CBD. Some people do not like um, undergarments and personal hygiene products, but those are actually pretty lucrative ads. So we encourage them to read those ads. Um, those get removed off the table entirely. Then everything else, the network will give you an initial list of advertisers, and then periodically update that list as they add more advertisers, especially active ones who are buying that week. And the talent gets a chance to approve or deny those ads, and those advertisers. And usually, if there is a minimum guarantee in these ads, the network is going to require that you approve a certain percentage of them, but they're not going to dictate which ones you approve and deny as long as you hit those baseline numbers.
And generally speaking, our first counter is always to ask for full approval of ads. Um, we often don't get that, but it's always the ask.
Right. And I do know, I mean, from personal experience, sometimes a topic or genre of product that someone doesn't want to advertise has been an opportunity for others. I worked on this podcast, Sex with Emily, which was on Acast, and a lot of people didn't want to touch, those types of products related to pleasure, I guess you could say. And she really took full advantage of that and became the go-to place for those products to advertise with. So kind of an interesting wrinkle there.
There
Um,
is there is always the possibility that if you are too, what's the word, if you're too sensitive about the types of products you want to advertise, and you want to rule out a lot, that there's a chance that affects the amount of money you're going to make in a deal. There's a client I was advising recently who had incredibly tight restrictions for a number of reasons, both personal and regulatory. And the universe of ads that they could accept on their show was like limited to basically nonprofits. And so I was begging with them to try and figure out a more expansive approach, because even though they had a good sized audience, I didn't see them getting the full value of that audience. You're muted.
Sorry, it looks like we have one last question from Patricia. is it more common for agents or lawyers to be negotiating deal points on behalf of podcaster personalities?
That's such a good question.
I mean, I often do it in partnership with lawyers. It just depends on the client. Some of them don't have a lawyer that they're working with regularly, and I'm in a position where I'm, marking up the terms and negotiating the deal on their behalf. If they have a lawyer, then we do it hand in hand.
Yeah. I have, so I've repped a number of ad sales networks, or not, sorry, a handful of ad sales networks, but they happen to be relatively big ad sales networks. So I saw like a lot of the inflow coming in. Um, Lately, this is a weird trend. Lawyers are getting involved much earlier in the process than they have been at any time. So it used to be that I would have my clients, the BA teams for these ad networks would send out term sheets, just like summaries of the material terms, and then it would get handed off to the studio's lawyer to do the standard terms, the long form, however they did it. And lately, the lawyers have been on those negotiations from day one, asking to see the full contract, asking to see the standard terms, asking to see the long form, and negotiating the language of the term sheets in a way that wasn't very common 5 years ago. Um, I would say it's still mostly handled by agents, or in many cases, the business partners of the podcaster. A lot of them have their own little teams. Um, but lawyers are kind of elbowing their way in.
I love it when lawyers elbow their way in, just to be clear. I find it very helpful.
Well, we just ran. Oh, we have one more question, and then I think we need to call it because my two wonderful panelists, I'm sure, have many clients to get to. But does a lawyer require a talent agent license, well, under California law to rep podcasters? Ash J, I guess that would depend on what state they're practicing in, correct?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I do know that I do all I know is that colloquially I've seen a lot of lawyers represent talent without an agent, and not just in podcasting, but in all facets of entertainment. So I
Mhm.
think I don't know the answer to that, but I have seen it happen.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you both so much again. And thank you to the Beverly Hills Bar Association for having this panel, again, about representing talent in the audio space. Thank you, everyone, for your questions as well.